They said no man ever came back the same from Silver Falls. But one quiet morning in Montana, a lone cowboy watched his horse break free and vanish into the mist rising off the canyon. He followed without question through pine, through fog, through the roar of falling water. What waited behind that curtain of mist wasn't just a cave. It was a secret buried for 40 years. A truth men had died to protect. And once he stepped inside, nothing about his name, his past, or the land beneath his boots would ever be the same. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. Montana's spring mornings had a way of deceiving a man. The calendar said the season had changed, but the wind disagreed, a thin, cold breath that crept through every crack in the wood, carrying the leftover chill of winter. The first light spilled across the valley like pale smoke, touching the dew-heavy grass and the distant sapphire mountains still capped with a sheen of frost. At the far edge of that valley stood a small ranch known to no one but the mail carrier and a few traders who passed twice a month Three Pines Ranch. Its owner, Elias McCord, was awake before the rooster, same as he had been for 20 years. He moved quietly through the kitchen, where the cast iron stove still glowed with the faint red of last night's coals. The smell of half-burnt coffee and pine smoke filled the cabin steady and familiar. He poured himself a cup, stood by the window, and looked out toward the barn as dawn stretched across the fields. It was another morning that looked exactly like the one before. And yet something in the air already felt different. Outside, the frost cracked softly under his boots. The horses stirred in their stalls, tails flicking, hooves shifting in the hay. Elias's life had narrowed down to this rhythm, and the same small motions that once trained soldiers now tended livestock. He had traded the sound of bugles for the creak of saddle leather, the order of formation for the quiet logic of seasons. He didn't talk much anymore. He didn't need to. Among the dozen horses he kept, only one followed him like a shadow, a dapple-gray stallion named Ranger. The horse had been with him through every kind of weather, every kind of silence. Strong-shouldered, silver-coated eyes, the color of stormlight, an animal that looked born from the same dust Elias carried in his bones. When he brushed the stallion's neck, Ranger's breath would fog the air between them, slow and calm like an unspoken language forged over years of survival. They understood each other in ways words could not explain, the rhythm of hooves that answered the beat of a heart, the quick glance of trust that no human could replicate. Some said soldiers came back from war with ghosts. Elias came back with a horse. For most of the year, life at Three Pines stayed uneventful. Feed the horses, mend the fences, ride the perimeter before sundown. A man could grow old in such repetition, without noticing the world changing beyond the hills. But in the last 3 days, the quiet had begun to fracture. It started small. Ranger left his feed untouched one morning, though the oats were fresh and the water clean. Elias noticed, frowned, but said nothing. The next night, he heard the stallion shifting restlessly in his stall, hooves tapping against the wood, breath-sharp tail lashing as if chased by something unseen. When Elias went out with a lantern, Ranger only stood there, muscles, trembling eyes fixed west toward the dark silhouette of the Silver Falls Ridge. At first, Elias thought it might be wolves or a bear. But there was no fear in the horse's stance. There was purpose. On the second morning, the same thing happened. Ranger refused food, stood motionless for hours, staring toward that same direction as the wind rose from the west. Each time a gust passed, his ears pricked forward, nostrils flared, and his entire body seemed to listen. Elias followed his gaze, but saw only pine trees and low-lying mist. By the third day, he could no longer dismiss it. When he came to clean the stall, He noticed something that stopped him: cold mud caked around Ranger's hooves, dark and metallic, with a sharp mineral scent that didn't belong anywhere near the ranch. The soil at Three Pines was light and dry, the color of sun-baked earth. This was different, almost black, sticky, smelling faintly of wet stone and iron. He crouched, ran his thumb through it, rubbed it between his fingers. "Where the hell have you been, boy?" he muttered. Ranger only snorted and turned his head toward the west again. That afternoon, Elias found fresh scratches along the stallion's neck and belly, thin parallel lines, like marks from squeezing through narrow branches. He brushed the coat, gently checking for burrs or thorns, and plucked out several pine needles, unlike any that grew around the ranch. Longer, darker, damp to the touch. From a forest higher up, maybe near the ridge where Silver Falls thundered down, he stood in the barn doorway for a long time, looking out across the valley. The waterfall lay miles away, hidden behind ridges and timber. He hadn't ridden there in years. Nothing out that way but rocks, fog, and the sound of falling water. But Ranger's eyes, steady, unblinking, seemed to say otherwise. That night, Elias couldn't shake the feeling of unease. He sat on the porch with a blanket over his shoulders, coffee cooling beside him, listening to the wind moving through the pines. The moon hung low, white and distant. Inside the barn, Ranger stamped once, twice, and then grew still again, except for his breathing heavy and deliberate, always facing west. Elias thought about the last time he'd felt that kind of pull, the one that draws a man toward danger without knowing why. It was years ago on a battlefield across the border. He'd learned then to trust instinct even when it made no sense. Now it wasn't his instinct whispering. It was his horse's. He leaned back, watching the barn through the silver haze of moonlight. A memory rose from long ago, his father's voice on a trail near Helena, when Elias was still a boy riding a pony too young for the saddle. A horse always knows the way home, even when a man forgets. Back then it had sounded like a proverb. Tonight it felt like a warning. Maybe Ranger wasn't restless because of fear or hunger. Maybe he remembered something Elias had forgotten, something buried beneath years of dust and silence. A call older than either of them, carried on the wind that rolled off Silver Falls. He stood, walked down to the barn, and unlatched the door. The stallion lifted his head, eyes catching the lantern light twin mirrors of molten silver. Elias reached out, ran a hand down the horse's neck. The muscles quivered under his palm. "Easy, boy," he whispered. "You hear something out there, don't you?" Ranger blew a short breath through his nostrils, a sound almost like agreement. Elias fetched a handful of fresh hay, but Ranger ignored it, staring beyond the open door, past the corral, toward the invisible ridge. The night air carried the faintest hum, maybe the river, maybe imagination. He could almost swear he heard water, distant but constant, falling in some hidden place between mountains. He tried to laugh it off. "You're making me superstitious," he murmured, but his voice held no conviction. The clock inside the house struck midnight. Somewhere in the valley, a coyote called. Ranger didn't flinch. His eyes never left that direction, the west, the waterfall, the secret beyond it. When Elias finally turned down the lantern, the barn was quiet again. He stood for a moment, watching the shadow of the horse cast long across the dirt floor. The animal's head was still lifted, still facing the unseen distance. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the smell of rain and the echo of rushing water, faint, persistent, like a memory refusing to fade. Elias closed the barn door and paused with his hand on the latch. Somewhere deep inside him, a thought stirred, quiet, but undeniable. Ranger wasn't just looking. He was remembering. And if that were true, then whatever lay beyond those pines wasn't finished with either of them yet. He stood there a while longer, listening to the silence, to the wind, to the steady breathing of the horse that seemed to be waiting for something only it could sense. Finally, Elias turned back toward the cabin. Behind him, through the thin crack of the barn door, the stallion's eyes caught the moonlight once more, bright, steady, and fixed on the dark line of mountains where Silver Falls roared unseen. The world was still gray when Elias saw the barn door hanging crooked on a broken hinge. The latch had been split clean through. The lead rope lay looped over a fence post like a shed snakeskin. Ranger was gone. Fresh, deep prints chewed the mud in a straight line toward the western ridge. Elias touched one with his fingers, the way a man might touch a vanished hand, and felt the cold push of morning seep into his bones. He didn't call out. The valley would carry no answer back. He moved fast, jacket gun knife canteen. He threw a saddle on Red the young bay that liked to run for the joy of it and swung up in one motion. A flick of the reins, a soft cluck between his teeth, and they were off-breath steaming hooves drumming a low, steady rhythm across the yard and into the open. Behind him, the valley yawned awake. Pale smoke rising from cook stove starlings, lifting off fence rails, frost sighing as the sun pried at its edges. But ahead, under a sky the color of hammered tin, something older than morning was calling him on. The valley was waking behind him, but something older was calling ahead. They hit wet grass that slapped Red's legs and left a spray of cold across Elias's boots. Dew clung silver to each blade. Ranger's prints ran plain as handwriting the long stride of a stallion on purpose. Elias leaned forward, eyes reading the ground, then the tree line, then the serpentine slashes, where a horse had parted ferns and pushed through brush. They entered the pines, and the light changed, narrowed into shafts, thinned into dust motes, thickened into sap scent and shadow. The air cooled. The pitch from cut trunks stung his nose. The forest swallowed sound and returned only breath and hoof and the creak of leather. Ranger had been here. Elias could see it in everything he passed. A branch snapped off at shoulder height. A line of shallow scrapes on a gray log at the trail's lip. A scuffed patch of earth where a horse had stood a long minute, ears forward listening. He thought not for the first time, he isn't running. He's following a path he already knows. Wind sighed through the needles with the far-off hush of surf. Somewhere under that breath, Elias imagined he caught another, fainter, steadier beating like a drum deep under rock. Hooves or his own heart? He wasn't certain. "You've been planning this, haven't you, boy?" He said aloud, his voice soft under the trees, half scold, half respect. Red blew out a snort and lengthened his gait. The bay could smell another horse, the musk of sweat and leather, the metallic whisper of water clay, drying on a coat. Elias crouched in the stirrups and studied a new print, where the path dipped and the mud was dark, iron-rich, exactly like the grit he'd wiped from Ranger's hooves at the ranch. He was on the right road. The land gathered into stone and funneled them through a narrow defile. The wind sharpened and came cold off hidden heights. The air carried a taste of damp rock and iron. Elias guided Red to a trickle of stream, cutting across the trail and let him drink, while clouds pulled fast, overhead shadows racing the ridge. Between the walls of the pass, a deeper sound took hold, quiet at first, then prying at every silence until it lived in the bones of the place. Water. Not creek chatter, but falling a body of water thrown hard enough to bruise it into voice. The canyon carried it everywhere. He remembered his father's hand on his shoulder years ago, when the world was taller and the horses were bigger and Silver Falls had been just a name on the wind. There are waters, son, that wash things away. And there are waters that hide them. He had not understood what that meant until now. Once as a boy, he'd asked to ride to the falls. His father had said no too many stories of men, and mounts knocked blind by spray and sound footing rolled out from under them, pulled under by their own weight. Elias had accepted it then, but time had a way of sending a man back along the roads he'd been turned from. The smell of minerals grew stronger, the red tang of iron stone, sweat-cold moss. Overhead, a ragged wheel of crows tipped and cawed as if they had found something the ground had not yet confessed. Then the pines fell away, and the sound became a wall. The lake lay dark and still as a beaten plate of steel. The cliff face rose sheer a curtain of a white, pouring from near its height, pummeling the pool in a convulsion of foam. Mist lifted and draped rainbows across the air, faint as a lie, and just as catching. Ranger stood at the margin between earth and water, as though the line had been drawn for him alone. Head lowered, ears pricked, every cord in his body drawn tight like a bow. Elias pulled Red up and slid to the ground. "Ranger," he called. "Easy now, boy." The stallion did not turn. He took one step, then another into the water. Ripples ran outward, cut by muscle and intent. Elias called again louder, but Ranger only set his jaw and went deeper until the lake rose to his shoulder and turned his silver coat black. When the stallion lifted his head and looked square at the white roar, Elias knew the choice had already been made. Ranger lunged, and the waterfall swallowed him in a single, violent breath. The sound rattled Elias's teeth. He threw the reins over Red's neck, plunged forward, and the water hit him like winter turned to iron. His chest locked. The world went white and wakeful and mean. He clawed with one hand, shielded his face with the other, felt himself pushed sideways, spun, smothered, churned, like he'd been fed to the mountains. Then, as suddenly as a door slamming, violence dropped away. He stumbled into air cold enough to hurt. His lungs dragged it in like a drowning man's first lie. Behind him, the waterfall roared against rock, a living curtain that shut the world outside in one long, endless sentence. Light filtered through the sheet of water and threw itself into flakes and blades across the ceiling. The cave was wider than he expected, floored in slick stone, rubbed smooth by time and something more than time. The air smelled of moss and rust and faintly old leather. Ranger stood mid-cavern's sides, heaving steam coiling from his nostrils, a victor holding the ground he had chosen. No panic in him now, no tremble. Only a stillness that said, "Here." Elias turned slowly. Rivulets threaded the walls in silver threads. A patter from the dark ceiling timed itself to his breath. His boots found purchase on stone worn by many weights. Not just water, not just wind. That was when he felt the age of the place press a hand over his heart. "This isn't a wild hole," he murmured. "Somebody came here, kept coming." Ranger lowered his head and looked into the unlit part of the cave where the light did not reach. Elias followed the gaze. Then he found a shape. He moved toward it, careful steps, left hand on the wall to steady himself, right hand ready at his belt. As the shimmer from the falls fell off, the thing took form, a squat, iron-bound chest, corners, rounded by years, a varnish of dust, layered so long it had grown its own color. On the lid, where his fingers wiped a line, clean letters rose in the cold HM. He touched the metal. It was grave cold. "Henry McCord," he breathed. "Grandfather." Ranger's ear flicked toward him, then back into the dark. Elias set his knife under the rust-flaked hasp, wrenched until the hinge barked and broke. The lid lifted with a sigh like a released secret. Inside, everything had been wrapped against damp, with oiled cloths and careful hands, a journal cracked at the spine and dark with years. Maps, hand-drawn edges scalloped ink brown as dried blood. Land deeds with proper seals. Contracts for water and mineral rights. And tucked in a fold of wool, a burnished cavalry badge that had been polished 100 times before being put away for the very last. He picked up the top page. The script bloomed neat and deliberate across it. He felt his hands tremble not from cold. If the McCord blood still runs true, the first line read, "The land will one day remember its name." A wind moved in the cave that had nothing to do with air. He turned pages, dates, names, the count and boundaries of fenced acres that did not match any belonging to the McCords now. Names he recognized from courthouse talk and drunken boasting in town, men whose fathers and grandfathers had built their reputations on generosity and grit, not one of them ever confessing the theft lodged at the heart of their good fortune. The journal began to tell the rest. Henry McCord wrote like a man who trusted paper more than people. In 1857, Blue Mesa Range had been his miles of grazewater that sprang sure, even in dry years, minerals he meant to leave in the ground. Then Silas Harrow, not yet a ranch lord, but already a danger, appeared with maps and clerks and a letter from the territorial office. Signatures had been forged, surveys altered, boundaries redrawn in a way that slid everything that mattered from McCord Inc. to other men's names. Henry fought. He rode to hearings where the answers had been decided before the doors had even opened. His bunkhouse burned. His men were jailed on charges that never made it to paper. He watched the deed to his life pass from his hand to a table he was not allowed to sit at. The later entries tightened into shorter lines, a soldier's script when the firing starts. "They have the seals," he wrote, "but not the truth. If any one of our blood finds this, know that the truth is here, dry and whole." Pages later, "There is a place behind the falls. The water hides better than any man. I will put what I can there and hope breath remains in the family long enough to find it." A loose sheet fell from the journal when Elias turned a page. He caught it before it hit the wet floor. The writing wavered. The ink spread like regret across the fibers. If the McCord name still rides in this valley, justice will find its trail. Be warned. Men who steal will kill to keep what they have stolen. Elias stood very still and let the truth arrange itself inside him. 3 Pines was not a scrap of luck that his father had fenced and bled over. It was a margin, a mercy, what was left after men took the heart of a thing and called the theft destiny. He saw his father again, the way the old man had gone quiet whenever the Harrow name came up. The way his eyes had flicked west in the evenings as if some low cloud were writing a message only he could read. He saw his father not telling him. Not because he didn't trust him, but because he feared what the knowing might do. "You hid it well, old man," Elias whispered. Ranger shifted, stepped forward, and nudged the iron chest with his muzzle as if to stamp his own acknowledgement upon it. The sound of the waterfall filled the empty places. Words could not. Then the horse's body went rigid. Elias heard it too distant at first, swallowed by roar and rock, but steady, inevitable hooves. 2 animals at least, maybe 3. Not wandering, coming in. He knelt, eased the chest lid down until it kissed the rim. Heart drumming, he pinched out the tiny lantern he'd lit without thinking. The cave darkened to the color of breath. The only light left was the torn silver thrown in around the waterfall's edge. Voices slipped through the curtain of water as if spoken by the cliff itself. "Tracks lead straight here. You sure it's the McCord man?" "Don't matter. Nobody else is fool enough to ride that trail." Elias slid the chest back into the darkest slot he could find, then pulled free the documents he could carry in his coat and bound them tight with twine. The badge he tucked into a pocket over his heart without deciding to. The journal went under his shirt, hot where his skin met leather. Another voice, young, hard, certain, rang through. Old Harrow said the McCord papers were hidden behind the falls. He was right. He could feel sweat under his palms, though the air bit cold. His revolver sat easy in his hand, metal smearing damp on his palm. Ranger let a warning sound roll low in his chest. No panic, just readiness. Elias crouched with him in the dark, the two of them breathing to the same slow count, while water wrote its endless script across the stone. Pride rose in him sharp and clean as the weight of his grandfather's name settled where it belonged. Fear walked beside it. Pride would not keep him alive. Fear would not carry what needed carrying. Stay and die. Go and be hunted. There was no third road. Ranger pawed once soft, urgent. Elias looked where the horse was pointing with his body into that seam of shadow where cold air slid through. He moved to it, found a slickness to the rock that the eye could not see and the hand could not miss. A narrow vein of wind stroked his cheek with the smell of pine pitch. "All right, old friend," he whispered, tying off the last knot in the twine. "Let's see if the world's ready for the truth." He looped the reins over the stallion's neck, shouldered his way sideways into the crack, and felt the mountain decide whether it would let him through. Outside, the sky had slumped low and sullen. Mist smoked off the lake and smeared the edges of the world. Silas Harrow sat his horse at the water's edge, black coat beating rain-white hair pasted to his hatband like a warning. He looked up at the falls as if it were an enemy who had outlived him by mistake. Reese Kavanaugh, short, thick through the shoulders rifle, cradled the way a preacher holds a book, pointed to the churned mud at the shore. "Same horse as yesterday," he grunted. "Dapple gray, long stride." Harrow's mouth flattened. His voice was rock dragged across rock. "Find the cave. End it clean." Two men peeled off to search the bank's eyes on Track's hands on triggers. "If the old man really left papers," Reese said almost gently, "the kid's got 'em now." Harrow didn't bother to look at him. "Then the kid dies like his grandfather did." The thunder that answered wasn't sky. It was water. In the dark seam of stone, Elias wormed his shoulders through until the crack let go and light bled in around his hat brim. The air outside knifed into his lungs. Resin stung his throat. He hauled the rest of himself out, then made room for Ranger, who compressed muscle and bone into a shape that could not exist and came out the mountain inch by inch, iron shoes ringing an alarm against stone. "Found something." Reese's voice leapt toward the falls. "The rocks are hollow here." Elias didn't run. He moved. There is a difference. He kept low under boughs, glistening with rain, pushed Ranger into the cover of scrub, and angled up the slope until the lake lay like a coin below him, and the men at its rim were reduced to shapes and intentions. From above, he could see it all. 4 horses tied near the shore. One man creeping into the pool up to his thighs, squinting under the waterfall's punishment. Harrow turned slightly, listening to the mountain with his eyes. Reese already scanning the tree line, as if danger always came downhill. Elias pressed a hand to Ranger's neck. "You found the truth," he said barely above breath. "Now help me keep it alive." The stallion stamped, once quiet, certain. Down at the water, someone shouted, "He's gone in there. I can see the torch marks, time pinched." Elias swung into the saddle-pointed Ranger along a goat path that ribboned the ridge east toward Red Hollow and let the stallion choose the speed. Give a smart horse a trail and he'll give you miles. Give him a reason and he'll give you his lungs. By the time Harrow's men realized the cave was empty and the mountain had a back door, Elias and Ranger were already a shadow sliding out of sight. He took the papers. Harrow's roar ran flat across the water. Reese studied the churned mud at the fisher's mouth, then the fresh scuffs leading uphill, and nodded once the way a man nods to his own thought. Fresh prints. Horse and man, less than an hour ahead. Harrow split his force without asking for advice. 2 went west to choke the valley's narrowest throat. 2 spurred along the main track toward town to cut him off, if he turned honest. Reese kept to the middle trailing sign with the patience of rain. Elias drove Ranger into the thickest line of pines, trading speed for cover. He stayed off the road off the known, letting the stallion thread elk tracks and dry creeks, old cattle traces, and the invisible lanes of things that moved before men came. The forest darkened around them until color thinned to texture and the world existed in smell and sound. Behind him, the land reported the pursuit, a stone dislodged, long after it should have stilled a jay, giving a sharp-edged alarm, the thud of a horse hitting a hard patch in just the way a ridden horse does. They were coming. A shot smacked a trunk a hand's width to Elias's shoulder and coughed a spray of bright wood into his face. Instinct pulled him low. "Go, boy," he barked. Ranger went. They hit a rill, and the water went up white and came down knives. Elias felt the cold in his teeth. They climbed the grade, pitching mean underfoot. Hoof iron caught and clanged. The stallion slipped, skated, recovered. Elias swung down shoulder to shoulder, pulling on the reins as if they were joined at the neck, and the fate of both was the same rope. From behind, Reese's voice came clean through the timber. "You can't outrun the truth, McCord." Elias turned his head just enough and let the answer go. "I don't have to. It's already catching you." They topped the rise. Elias fired twice downhill, not to hit, but to interrupt belief. Echo answered echo until even the hill didn't know how many riders had fired and from where. The pursuers checked as men do when sound tricks them into seeing more than is there. A second is a lifetime when breath is running thin. They took it. Ranger bled speed back into strength, found a new line through scrub and char, where last summer's fire had scrubbed the valley down to bone. The ground there was treacherous ash, disguised as soil, old roots lying like snakes, waiting to turn an ankle they no longer owned. The stallion's chest worked like a bellows. Steam rose off his flanks. The world narrowed to each next safe step and the promise of the one after that. Evening stripped color from the hills and replaced it with outline. Fog laid itself down in the swales. The moon came late and weak, a coin spent to almost nothing. The chase turned into a war of listening men, against men, beast against stone, memory against map. Elias felt Ranger's lungs labor and fed him his own calm. "Just a little more, partner," he said, "voice the rope that holds when the rest won't." They ran into the night until the night gave them a gift, a shoulder of land that broke clean toward Red Hollow and offered a view of what waited a thin scatter of lamps. A line of roofs, the square of the marshal's office, marked by a lamp that burned as if it didn't know how to go out. Elias eased Ranger down to a walk and let the stallion drink air. He slid from the saddle and stood close, one hand checking the packet pressed to his ribs, the journal, the maps, the deeds dry tight, whole. He could feel the badge under his shirt like a small, bright weight. Down valley, a campfire pulsed red, where Harrow's men gathered their breath and their anger. The wind brought the smell of wet grass and burned powder. It brought something else too, resolve maybe. A line of it drew straight from this hill to that lighted door. "They'll keep coming, boy," he said almost to the night, "till someone says stop." Ranger lifted his head toward the far lamps, toward Law. "Then we don't stop either," Elias said. He gathered the reins. The stallion blew a long, steady breath, squared himself to the slope, and started down. Above them, clouds slid back from the moon and left the world outlined in a thin, forgiving silver. The hunted had become the witness, and dawn would decide who the land truly belonged to. The first light over Red Hollow came soft and colorless, the kind that feels more like memory than morning. Mist drifted low between the rooftops, curling around chimneys and fence posts, wrapping the whole town in quiet. A single wagon creaked down Main Street, its wheels whispering through mud that hadn't yet decided to freeze or thaw. Elias McCord rode in slow, the kind of slow that belongs to men who have outrun everything else. Ranger's coat was dulled by sweat and rain, and the silver turned pewter beneath the dawn. Both horse and rider carried the look of distance dust on Boots' coat, torn at the shoulder, the smell of river mud and smoke clinging to them like old debt. They stopped before the two-story brick building that bore the sign Marshal's Office, U.S. Federal Jurisdiction. The lantern inside still burned a yellow pulse against the frost-rimmed glass. Elias swung down stiffly tied Ranger to the post and lifted a small iron chest from the saddlebag. The weight of it was more than metal. It was time itself pressed into shape. He pushed through the door. The hinges groaned like tired men. Behind the desk sat a woman with gray, threaded through her dark hair sleeves rolled to the elbow. Spectacles balanced low on her nose, Marshal Lucille Grant. The room smelled of ink oil and long nights spent reading reports by lamp. Her eyes lifted. They were the kind that had seen too much to be surprised easily. "Can I help you, Sir?" Elias placed the chest on her desk with both hands. The thud echoed off the walls. His voice came rough but steady. "These papers belong to Henry McCord," he said. "They'll tell you what happened to this valley." Grant looked from the box to the man. Her gaze measured the details, the cracked lips, the dried blood along one knuckle, the mud-stained coat, then shifted toward the window, where Ranger waited standing tall even in exhaustion. She nodded once and gestured toward the chair across from her. "Sit down, Mr. McCord." He did. The chair creaked under his weight. Outside, the first true ray of daylight slipped through the fog and struck the iron chest. Dust motes spun above it like tiny planets. Somewhere far away, a bell tolled the kind town's ring when a new day and an old reckoning arrived together. The past was ready to speak. Lucille Grant worked like a surgeon, slow, exact, deliberate. She broke the wax seals with the handle of her penknife and peeled back the lid. Inside lay the relics of a story long buried: yellow deeds, a leather-bound journal, water-stained maps, drawn in careful hand contracts, stamped with legitimate federal marks, and a letter folded so many times the paper had grown thin. She examined each page beneath the lamplight, tracing the embossed seals with her thumb, comparing signatures to the ledger books behind her. Her lips pressed tighter with every match she confirmed. At last, she set the papers down, rubbed her eyes, and looked across the desk. "Mr. McCord," she said quietly, "do you understand what you've brought me?" Elias nodded once. Enough, he said, to end a 40-year lie. For a long moment, neither spoke. The clock on the wall ticked toward 7. Outside, the town began to stir, boots on boardwalks, the bark of a dog, the shuffle of doors being unlatched. The noise of life returned, but in this room, it was all stillness. Then Grant stood. The leather of her holster creaked as she moved. She crossed to the iron cabinet, unlocked it with a ring of keys, and pulled out a large ledger and a seal. Her pen scratched fast and firm across the page ink, soaking into government paper like judgment into ground. "I'm issuing warrants," she said, without looking up. Effective immediately. By noon, riders had left in every direction, badges flashing against the pale sun, deputies of the United States, spreading through the hills and gullies of Blue Mesa. The word traveled faster than the law itself that the McCord papers had come home, that an old theft was about to meet its reckoning, and that a worn cowboy had ridden all night through rain and ghosts to deliver justice in a wooden box. By afternoon, Red Hollow gathered along the main street. Nobody said much. The air itself seemed to be holding its breath. Down the road came the deputies, 4 of them leading a line of captured men. At their head rode Silas Harrow, once the richest name in the valley, now just another man with his hands bound and his eyes emptied out. Mud streaked his boots. His coat, once black and polished, hung heavy with rain. He didn't resist. He didn't need to. The look on his face said he'd known this day would come. He just hadn't known whose hand would deliver it. Behind him trudged Reese Kavanaugh, hat gone, wrists tied. The afternoon wind picked up dust from the road and swirled it around their legs. The townsfolk watched from porches and doorways, their silence a harder sentence than any judge could give. Elias stood on the office porch beside Ranger. His expression didn't change, not triumph, not anger, just the deep calm of someone who has seen a circle finally close. Marshal Grant stepped out beside him. Her hat cast a sharp shadow across her eyes. "Justice doesn't ride fast, Mr. McCord," she said, voice even as stone. "But it never forgets where it's going." Elias gave a small, tired smile. "Guess some trails just take longer to ride." Harrow passed them without a word. His gaze flicked once toward Elias, searching for something, mercy, hatred, maybe recognition, and found only distance. Behind him, Reese stumbled, caught himself, and looked up at the sky as if trying to memorize its color. When the wagon carrying them turned the corner and vanished into the haze of the lower road, Ranger blew through his nostrils and shook his mane, scattering beads of water like glass. The sound broke whatever spell had held the street in stillness. Sunlight cut through the clouds for the first time in days, spilling over the wet brick and dust. The air smelled of clean earth. The long winter of Blue Mesa was ending. 3 months passed. By spring, the snow had retreated to the highest ridges, leaving the valleys green again. The streams ran clear thick with meltwater that sang through the culverts. Word from Helena arrived in a sealed envelope. The McCord claim was restored. The federal court recognized every document Elias had delivered. The land that had been stolen was legally his, or rather, his family's once more. The Harrow estate stood empty at the far end of the valley, its windows boarded, its fences rotting under the thaw. When Grant offered him the keys, Elias shook his head. "I've got all the home I need," he said. He rebuilt Three Pines Ranch instead, plank by plank, with the same deliberate patience his grandfather must have used. The cabin stayed small. The stove stayed old. The view, as always, belonged to the hills. Spring came early that year. The meadows flamed with wildflowers. Herds grazed freely where the fences had fallen. The wind carried the scent of pine and thawing soil. People rode out from Red Hollow on Sundays to see the man who'd brought the valley its name back. They called him the man who rode for justice. Elias would only smile and say, "I just followed where the horse led." Ranger had healed well. The silver in his coat burned bright again under the sun. Every morning they rode the perimeter together, across fields that once belonged to ghosts, but now belonged to time. Elias always took the same route down the ridge past the creek, through the low pasture where his father once taught him to ride. Sometimes children from the town would watch from the road. To them, the tall man and his shining horse looked like something from another age, not quite real, but too solid to be legend. At night, when the wind passed through the pines behind the cabin, Elias swore he could hear faint echoes, the creak of old saddles, the low rumble of hooves on earth, and his grandfather's voice folded somewhere inside it all. "Hold the land, boy. Hold it honest." He'd nod as if the wind could see. One evening, late in the season, Elias and Ranger were returning from a long circuit of the upper range. The sun was dipping behind the peaks, turning the sky to copper. The air smelled of river water and young grass. They followed the narrow road that curved toward the canyon. The sound of the Silver Falls reached them before the sight, that familiar rush, that pulse in the air that felt older than language. When they came to the turnoff, Ranger slowed, then stopped, his ears tipped forward. The wind lifted his mane and carried the spray of the waterfall's mist across them both. Elias let the reins fall slack and looked where the horse was looking. The falls glowed under the dying light, a column of gold and white, tumbling from the cliffs, breaking into clouds before hitting the pool below. The same water that had once hidden a secret now sang freely in the open. He reached out and laid a hand against Ranger's neck. The muscle beneath was solid and warm. "Guess you knew it all along?" he said softly. The horse breathed deep as if to answer, then turned his head slightly toward the wind. For a moment, the two of them stood there, man and animal, bound by silence and something that felt like understanding. Then Ranger stepped forward again, steady and sure hooves tapping lightly on the wet stones. Elias let him lead. The wind from the falls swept over the grasslands, cool and clean, carrying the scent of fresh water and the first shoots of clover. It moved across the valley, over the rebuilt fences, through the open doors of barns and houses, through the lives of everyone who'd chosen to stay. It carried with it no anger, no vengeance, only renewal. And as the last light of day turned the spray to silver, Elias McCord felt something settle inside him. Not victory, not pride, but peace. The past had finally come home, and so had he. The horse had always known where home was. The man just had to follow. A month after spring settled into Blue Mesa, the days came on mild and honest, and a man could forget that winter had ever put its teeth in the valley. Elias was out along the north fence, with a pocket full of nails and a hammer gone smooth at the handle, when he heard the hollow thump of a horse crossing the creek plank. He straightened and turned. The red hollow post rider came in at a fast trot, sweat dark on the gelding's chest, the leather mail pouch banging against his leg. "Mr. McCord," he called, breath fogging a little in the cool. "From Helena. Marked urgent." Elias wiped sawdust from his palms and took the envelope. It was heavy stock, the kind officials favor when they want the paper to do some of the talking. He slid a thumb under the seal and opened it there in the grass, while the fence wire hummed in the wind. Reese Kavanaugh had escaped. He read the words twice slow, letting each settle. The prison wagon had been ambushed at Bitter Creek. 2 guards dead, the transport horse shot and left where it fell. The report ended with clipped sentences, a neat signature, and then a second sheet, a short note in a hand he knew. "Be cautious." Marshal Lucille Grant had written. "A man like him doesn't run. He hunts. And he remembers." Elias lowered the page. The light slanted late afternoon gold through the grass, and Ranger on the slope above stopped chewing and lifted his head, one ear cocked north. The stallion didn't snort or stamp. He just listened like a man listening for a train he didn't want to hear. "Go on," Elias told the post rider without looking away from the ridge. "There's coffee at the house if you need it." "Much obliged," the young man said, and guided his horse toward the porch. Elias slid the letter back into its envelope and tucked it inside his coat. He finished 3 more nails he didn't need to finish and walked home with the deliberate pace of a man making no sudden promises. That evening, he checked each latch twice, stacked 2 extra rails against the barn door, and tied a knot in the lead rope he'd never tied before. When the lanterns were out and the valley went quiet, the last line of Grant's note kept walking the room. He remembers. The wind shifted 2 nights later. It came thin and dry off the north, smelling of far-off rain run through gravel and dust. The change hit Ranger first. The stallion started waking in the small hours, head high, breathing careful hooves, lifting and setting down like he was testing the ground for lies. Elias would lie still and listen to the horse listening, and somewhere between those two silences, he felt the old caution return, the kind that had kept him alive, when men hunted other men and called it duty. On the 4th morning, he saddled up without a plan and rode the timberline where the pines start to lean into mountain. The air held the faint bite of iron, and beneath the needles, the ground had taken a scuff that didn't belong to deer. At the edge of a clearing, he saw a spent cartridge sunk halfway into the dirt, the brass polished clean by a thumb. The base had been scratched with 2 letters R and C cut with a knife point, the way a man marks his gear when he means to claim it for the last time. Elias crouched and didn't touch it. He let his eyes travel the clearing. A few branches were snapped at chest height. A ring of ash showed where a small fire had burned short and hot, a soldier's fire, nothing wasted. He looked north to where a seam of storm stacked itself along the Bitter Creek country. The thought walked across his mind without knocking. The man who hunted others had learned how to become weather. That night the sky didn't so much darken as drop. Thunder laid its weight on the cabin roof, and rain fell with a force that felt personal. The wind braided the water into ropes that flung themselves against the east wall. The house held. Ranger circled in the stall, head up, nostrils wide, not scared ready. Elias oiled the colt on the table and checked each chamber until the motions calmed him. The lamp carved a warm island in the room and turned the storm into a thing that existed beyond the circle he could control. Sometime after midnight, he caught it the wrong light inside the rain. Far off through the glass, low in the trees, a tremor of orange moved where lightning did not. He blew the lamp out, and the house went black. The storm came harder, hiding his steps, as he shrugged into his coat and took the gun and stepped into the weather. Water climbed his boots and stayed there. He followed the new cut of runoff down the path and over to the creek where the flood swelled at the bend. In a stand of fir beyond, something flared and then dimmed. A campfire banked and prodded to speak, only when told. He crossed the creek on stones that had no business offering safe passage in such a night, and moved through the wet pine until he reached the flat rock where boys used to come to skip pebbles in calmer seasons. On that rock lay a shiny cartridge, bright as a coin in a dead man's hand. Placed, not dropped. Aligned straight, a message you had to come into the rain to read. Elias did not touch this one either. He stood with the storm shouldering at him and said into the dark, low and polite, "If you want me, you'll have to step into the light." Thunder answered. It carried the sound of hooves from nowhere in particular and everywhere a little. The fire winked out. Water scoured the rock clean around the cartridge and left it shining even more. He walked back slow. Ranger waited under the eave mane, plastered to his neck, eyes wild with reflection, where the distant lightning caught them. Elias rested a hand between the old horse's eyes until the breath came easier for them both. He slept in the chair with the colt across his lap, and through the open gap of the stall, he watched the night turn itself into morning. He had thought justice was behind him, but justice had a long memory, and so did vengeance. The west wind rose at the tail end of June and could not decide if it wanted to warm or burn. Elias was at the table writing the day down the way a man fixes a fence, so the next storm finds it ready when the smell reached him. Smoke that wasn't lamp or bacon, a bitter smell with its own opinion. He stood, and the scent thickened, tangling with the drafts under the door. When he stepped outside, the horizon to the west glowed a dark wrong red. Harrow Estate was burning. The light bled up into the clouds and turned them into a roof of coals. Ranger screamed once sharp and danced against the lead rope until Elias unknotted it with fingers that did not fumble. Easy, he said, though nothing about the night was. He grabbed the water pail as habit as prayer and swung into the saddle. By the time they topped the first rise, they could feel the heat on their faces. Grass snapped and ran like fuse wire. Sparks flew ahead of the front and landed glowing in the ravine brush. The house-black windows, big roofline, and all its old arrogance stood against the blaze for one long moment. Then a beam somewhere failed, and the thing folded in on itself with a roar that took the night with it. Red Hollow turned out. Men with hat brims pulled low against ash, women with shawls over their mouths, children wide-eyed and silent carrying buckets smaller than their fear. The wet canvas stretched into a line, and the line started to work. Every bucket traveled hand to hand across the human chain with a rhythm that belonged to older songs. The wind, stubborn and strong, tried to break the cadence. The people kept the beat. Elias took the far side where sparks were hunting open ground. The smoke rolled low. His tongue tasted it and turned to dirt. Through the clamor, voices, orders, the panicked laughter you hear only when a town refuses to cry. Another sound cut through raw and ripping a horse screaming. He ran toward it. The old Harrow stable, set back a little from the house, had taken fire at the roof and was shedding flaming shingles like hateful rain. Inside, animals battered the stall's eyes, showing white. The main door was warped and would not give. Elias braced and hit it with a shoulder he couldn't spare. It held. He hit again and felt something in him answer wrong. The door bucked and split just enough. Ranger came past him, then not as a rescue saint, but as a working horse who understood in his mind and bones that another horse was about to die. The stallion drove his chest against the gap, forced it, and Elias got an arm through to lift the bar. The door went out, and smoke belched. They entered the heat together. A young stud, blind with terror, lunged and clipped Elias hard enough to send him skidding across the straw. The world reeled and tried to lie down. Ranger moved between the colt and the fire, absorbing sparks along his withers, and used the iron weight of his presence the way a seasoned horse does calm as command. The colt found him and followed. They cleared the first stall, then the second. A mare, sides heaving, let Elias get a rope on her and came into the night sobbing the way a living thing sobs when breath returns after being refused. A mule stood stupid and brave, refusing to believe the roof was coming down until Ranger put his shoulder to it and bullied the beast into motion. They pulled 3 more out with men from Red Hollow joining the drag, and then the loft came down with a howl and a shower of sparks that turned the yard into daylight for one bright, wrong second. Rain came at last, late and heavy, pounding the cinders flat and turning the ash to paste. The fire laid down under water's old argument. The wind lost interest. The night, exhausted, chastised, took back its proper darkness. At sunrise, the Harrow estate was a rib cage of black stone around a char heart. The chimneys stood in the emptiness like grave markers that didn't know the names. Elias and Marshal Grant walked the ruins in boots that sank and sucked. The air still tasted like questions no one wanted to ask. Arson, Grant said, not as guess, but judgment. She pointed at the neat triangle where a petroleum can had bled itself into the flagstones. Several starts. Somebody wanted it to race. They circled the kitchen garden now, just a square of cinder and the sweet, sick smell of roasted herbs. In one corner, a set of stones had fallen in where the ground sounded hollow. Seller Elias said. They pried the iron hatch with a crowbar borrowed from a neighbor and got it open on the third try. A breath of air came out, a wet, mineral exhale that cooled his face. The ladder down was scorched, but holding. He went first, Grant, after the damp stone swallowing the light of their lantern, to a small, stubborn puddle. The basement stretched bigger than the house had implied, arched with old mason's pride. At the far wall, a safe squatted, fire blistered and sulking. It took a long time and a lot of words better left unwritten to persuade the safe to confess. When it did, it gave up maps, multiple layered, each more polished than the last. Leases and permits bore seals that knew how to lie beautifully. The names of creeks and ranges from Helena and Bozeman to Bitter Creek crawled across them in respectable ink. Grant studied the signatures with a scowl that ran from her brow to her mouth. Same hand, she said, same seal. The trick that took your valley took others. They built an empire out of stolen dirt. Elias looked from page to page, the old anger burning clean without heat. Then we'll see how deep that empire goes. That night, sitting on the porch with the smoke of the ruins still ghosting the far hills, he tried to name the thing the fire had left behind. It wasn't just ruin. It wasn't just room. It was a horizon without a house standing wrong in front of it. It was the first view in a long time that belonged to the land and not to theft. The rain had rinsed the valley. The people had rinsed it more. The fire had burned Blue Mesa clean, but it had also lit a road to something far darker. The documents had an order of their own. When Elias spread them across the marshal's desk, the pages drifted to neighbors they seemed to know. That was how he found the one he hadn't expected, thin, parchment-headed Blue Mesa Aquifer Survey, 1874. The script in the corner was neat and firm. Eleanor McCord. He said the name aloud, and it didn't fit in his mouth right away. He had never been told there was another McCord in the records, besides Henry, and a few cousins who'd lit out early or drunk themselves into short songs. Grant went to the dustiest ledger and pulled it down like she knew the dance by heart. She paged back to summer of '74, ran her finger along lines of small type. Here, she said, Eleanor McCord, contracted to the Federal Water Office as a geological surveyor. Age 27. Disappeared with a field crew in late September. File closed without conclusion. Elias stared at the name until it was someone. So there was another McCord who fought the same war, he said, only underground. Later, in the stack of char-stained notebooks from the Harrow cellar, he found pages that could have been a voice. The writing was tight, careful. The words were not sentimental. They did not need to be. The water beneath Blue Mesa runs deeper than law or claim. It belongs to no man. But they will come for it. The entries read like field notes, measurements, strata flow rates, and then without warning, a sentence with a bruise inside it. Reports had been submitted. Revisions demanded. Markups appeared in margins that weren't hers. Names with authority had insisted the water under Blue Mesa did not exist as described. Falsified data, the accusation said. Eleanor had written the accusation out in a steady hand, like she was copying a joke without laughing. One-page edges, fire-curled, held a line that made the air feel thinner. If the McCord name survives, tell them water is the true inheritance. Protect it not for us, but for the land. Elias stood a long time with that sentence under his eyes. He had thought he had brought home a victory whole enough to last. This told him he had brought home the lid to a well he had not yet looked down. We verify, Grant said. There was tired in her voice and iron under it. We don't guess. They rode out with a roll of copies, a coil of rope, and an old engineer's level Grant had acquired from a mine inspector who owed her a favor. Ranger went in the lead, his age showing now only in the way he took his time, choosing certain steps. They followed the routes Eleanor had drawn. Creeks met and parted just where she'd sketched their marriage. Dry washes cut into the earth where she'd predicted they would in late-season storms. Every now and then, a modern survey marker winked like a belated apology. In a rocky fan at the foot of the northern benches, they came to a low mouth of stone, a seam almost mean enough to refuse them. Cold air puffed from it that smelled like caves, smelled the breath of limestone and long secrecy. Inside light gathered reluctantly. Their footsteps took the world and gave it back as echo. Ranger waited outside, head turned, listening in that deep way horses do when their people are under the ground. The cave opened into a chamber not much bigger than the cabin, and there the sound changed. Water not loud, not waterfall, but persistent, an old animal working in darkness. From a crack in the floor, a clear spring bubbled with such calm insistence, it felt like the room's heart. Elias knelt, cupped his hands, and brought the cold to his mouth. It tasted like stone and time and something he would not name. She found it, he said, voice small under the rock. The heart of Blue Mesa. Grant squatted with a sample bottle and a notebook. And maybe the reason she never came back, she said it matter of fact. You find something like this, and the wrong eyes notice. On the walk back to daylight, they didn't talk much. Sun hit them in the face and made them squint and smile like fools. Ranger nosed Elias's shoulder, smelling cave on him, and wickered low. They marked coordinates and wrote letters, and the wheels of a better machine began to turn slow, loud reel. The state and then the federal men came out and pretended to discover what had already been found, and for once, that was all right with Elias. Let the law wear the badge. Let the land keep the glory. That night, under a moon that had earned the right to be called Old Elias, sat on the porch and watched the creek lantern itself with sky. Ranger drank at the bend lift and lower as patient as a prayer. He turned Eleanor's words over again. Paper justice had given the land back its name. But water justice, the kind that outlives men, would keep the land alive. He looked out across the dark and felt the story shift from victory to stewardship. Not a burden, a belonging. Some legacies came stamped and sealed and notarized. Others were cut into bedrock by flow and time to be read by anyone who remembered how. Some legacies are written on paper, others are carved beneath the earth. The years moved the way wind carves a canyon, slow, patient, but permanent. More than a decade had passed since the night of the fire and the discoveries that followed the unearthing of a family's buried truth, the maps, the spring, the proof that some things run deeper than greed ever could. Blue Mesa had changed since then, and so had the man who once rode across it. Now the valley was called Blue Mesa Wildlife Preserve, its boundaries marked by weathered fencing and a tall arch of cedar wood, where tourists stopped to read the words carved deep into the grain. Blue Mesa Range, where the land remembers. The land did remember. The grass had grown thicker, richer. Elk grazed in the northern meadow. The creeks, once dry or poisoned by men's ambition, now ran clean as morning glass. And in a small cabin of pine and stone at the valley's center, Elias McCord lived as quietly as the seasons would let him. His hair had turned white, but not the pale of surrender, more the color of the mountains after first frost. His left hand shook a little when he poured his morning coffee, but his eyes were steady. Still gray, still sharp, still the kind that had watched too many things end and understood how they began. Ranger was still with him, Vodlin, a ghost of muscle and memory, the silver stallion who had carried him through fire and storm. The horse's coat had faded almost to white now, and his steps were slow, deliberate. But he never missed a sunrise. Every dawn, Ranger would make the same short walk from the corral to the bluff above Silver Falls stand, with his head lifted toward the roar, and just listen. Some mornings, Elias joined him, a hand resting on that familiar neck, both of them staring at the mist that hung where the waterfall met the wind. People from Red Hollow often came through these days, students, park rangers, journalists, asking questions, taking notes. They called Elias the man who rode through a storm to give the land back its name. He never argued. He never confirmed it either. He would nod, maybe smile, maybe pour them coffee, then go back to mending fences that no longer needed mending. Because some legends were truer when they weren't explained. It was on a soft April noon when the melt water still carried snow's memory that a rider appeared on the southern road. Elias spotted her from the porch, the shape familiar even before the face came clear. A gray coat, a straight posture, a horse that walked like it didn't fear anything. He set down his tin mug and smiled. Didn't think the wind would bring you back this far. Lucille Grant swung down from the saddle. Her hair had gone silver-braided tight beneath a wide-brimmed hat. The years had marked her, but they hadn't softened her. "Thought I'd see what a legend looks like when it gets old," she said, voice dry as sagebrush. Elias laughed quietly. "You're about 10 years too late for that." They sat on the steps of the porch, 2 tin cups between them, steam rising into the cool air. The view from there was what it had always been, the open plain rolling into green hills, the thin line of the creek flashing where the sun found it. For a while they said nothing. Then the talk came easy like it used to about the old days, the trial, the land titles, the folks who had stayed and the ones who hadn't. Grant told him the last of the Harrow holdings had been turned over to the state. The old mines sealed the deeds burned. Then her tone shifted. "They found Reese Kavanaugh," she said, "about a year after he ran. North of Bitter Creek, shot through the chest. Looked like it had been years. Gun was still in his hand." Elias didn't answer right away. He looked out across the field where the wind bent the tall grass into waves. "He finally found what he'd been chasing," he said softly. Grant nodded. "Maybe he wasn't chasing you, Elias. Maybe he was running from himself." Neither spoke after that. The silence between them wasn't heavy. It just was old honest, the kind that could hold more than words. The wind slid through the pines behind the house, carrying that low whistle of memory. It sounded almost like a horse snorting in the distance, almost like thunder that had forgotten its strength. Toward evening, the light began to turn the valley gold. Grant suggested a walk. Elias saddled Ranger for the first time in weeks, just for the slow ride down the familiar trail. The path to Silver Falls had changed since the old days. There was a wooden railing now, a sign warning visitors not to go too close. Gravel crunched beneath their boots, and the air grew cooler, wet with mist. Ranger took each step carefully, the rhythm of his hooves steady and deliberate. Elias walked beside him, one hand on the reins, the other resting on the horse's shoulder. When they reached the clearing, the waterfall shone like a sheet of molten glass, all gold and white in the last light. Where the hidden cave had once waited behind the curtain of water, there was now only a plaque mounted on stone site of the McCord discovery, 1897, where justice found its way home. Elias stood there for a long time, reading the words without really reading them. After all these years, Grant said beside him, "Do you ever wonder if it was worth it?" He smiled faintly, eyes on the falls. "It was never about land," he said. "It was about remembering who we were." The wind rose just then, sudden and wide, scattering spray into the air, so that for a moment it looked like the whole valley was covered in silver dust. Ranger lifted his head eyes, reflecting that shimmer old eyes, clouded but bright, as if he saw something they couldn't. He stood that way for a while, unmoving ears tilted toward the sound of the water. Elias reached up and laid his hand on the horse's neck. "Easy, old boy," he murmured. "You brought us this far." Grant turned away, giving them the moment. The sound of the falls filled everything, the water, the air, the pauses between breaths. The sun dropped behind the ridge soon after. The light bled out of the valley, slow, reluctant, painting the sky in shades of copper and gray. When it was time to go, Grant gathered her reins, tightening the strap with the quiet care of someone who had said too many goodbyes in her life. Elias walked with her to the gate. Ranger stood a few yards behind the long shadow of his body, stretching across the grass. Grant mounted, then paused, looking down at him. "You know," she said, "most folks say the wind forgets everything." Elias glanced toward the horizon, where the clouds moved like slow herds. "Not here," he said. "Not this land." Grant smiled. "Then maybe that's why it remembers you." He didn't answer, just tipped his hat. The marshal turned her horse and rode south, her figure shrinking until it dissolved into the trembling air. Elias stood for a moment longer, watching the road where she'd gone. Then he turned back toward Silver Falls. The evening breeze was stronger now, pushing through the valley, rattling the fence posts, setting the grass in motion. It smelled of rain and stone and faraway snowmelt. Ranger was still standing by the bluff. The horse turned his head as Elias approached, and for the first time in many months, the old stallion gave a low, soft whinny, almost a whisper, almost a goodbye. Elias laid a hand against the weathered hide, feeling the slow, deep pulse beneath. "Rest easy, partner," he said quietly. "You've done your part." The horse breathed out a long, tired sigh and lowered his head. A gust of wind swept across the mesa, bending the wild grass flat. The surface of the lake below rippled, scattering the reflection of the moon that had just climbed above the ridge. For a heartbeat, the sound that came back through the canyon wasn't wind at all. It was the steady rhythm of hooves, faint but clear, riding the echo. Elias closed his eyes and let it move through him, the sound, the air, the memory of everything he'd loved and lost in this valley. They said the wind never remembers. But in Blue Mesa, it always found its way back home.